I was placing a charge on the door, ready to make explosive entry, and somebody bumped into something on the stairs behind me and like made a noise, like clanged metal or whatever. And the guy in the apartment that I was placing the charge on the door of actually came to the door. He looked at me. Explosive breach, and you're putting a charge up, your rifle's sort of slung to the side. So I didn't have my rifle accessible. And this guy walks up to the door. So the only thing I could think to do is pull my pistol out and put it up in his face through the glass in the door. And I just mouthed to him, "Open the door." I was the youngest of all the grandchildren. And my mom's father and my dad's father both served in World War II. So when I was a kid, because I was the youngest grandchild, I got my mom's father, my grandfather, kind of at a point in his life where he started talking about his time in World War II and his experiences. And I don't know if, that generation didn't really talk about their experiences in the war. But for some reason, he reached that point in his life where he started to share some stories. Whether he was telling a happy story or a sad story or something exciting, he always talked about World War II with such passion and such reverence. Like it was such a positive experience in his life, even though it wasn't all positive. And I think that had an impact on me at an early age. But I took an interest in the military probably seriously at about 16 or 17 years old. So I went to infantry basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. There's culture shock when you first arrive. They sort of strip everything away from you, cut your hair, and I had long hair at the time, so that was a bit traumatic. But they break you down to build you back up.
You ended up in the 75th Ranger Regiment?
I did.
And for someone that has never heard of the Ranger Regiment, are you able to explain who they are and I guess what the purpose in the military is?
In essence, they're the top fighting force in the U.S. Army.
Did you feel like that was the right place for you at the time?
I did, yeah. When I got there in 1995, 96, it was on the heels of a few things. So in 1993, you had the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, and the company of Rangers that was involved in that engagement was Bravo Company, 3rd Ranger Battalion. And so there was relatively recent combat experience in the battalion. So you had a lot of leadership. We call them non-commissioned officers, sergeants and staff sergeants, sergeant first class, that had been to war. And so what came with that was a sense that you were getting really current combat training. Like they were preparing you to go to war and you were getting it from guys that had just been there. So I really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed the things that we did and was excited to be there.
And how long before you decided that you might want to apply for the Special Forces?
Yeah, a couple years. I went to selection, kind of wide-eyed, didn't know what I was getting myself into, but was excited to be there. And I was unsuccessful. I made it about 90% of the way through. And I ended up getting pulled in one of the last days. And as they say to you, they don't give you a lot of information, but they say failure to meet the time standard, which basically means I wasn't fast enough. But I had done everything else. But in my exit interview, in failing that, they asked me if I would return and try again. And so I took that as a positive. So even though I failed selection, I was a very young guy, didn't know what I was getting into, and they asked me to come back. So that was exciting, and that's exactly what I did. One of my favorite quotes is a winner is just a loser that tried one more time. And I think I kind of epitomized that through my career. But I think I was smarter the second time. I had an ankle injury shortly before my return trip. So I was recovering from an ankle injury. I was a bit discouraged because of that, so I didn't get to train as much as I wanted. So honestly, the second time around, mentally, I felt like I was slower than I was the first time, so I wasn't sure that I was going to get through it. But I think I made better decisions. A lot of selection, not unlike SAS, it revolves around land navigation and moving over a distance with a map and compass in a set period of time. And the decisions that you make in that land navigation are critical to how quickly you do it, And I think the second time around, I just made smarter choices. So, yeah, ultimately, I was successful.
What's the retention rate like with selection?
Um, yeah, rough numbers. They run a couple of classes a year, and there's probably 110 or 120 guys. And any given class, there's been classes that have had one person get through. There's been classes that have had 15. But my guess would be around 10% finish the selection portion itself. I think they even said that to me when I finished selection was, we're going to take a chance on you, which was quite a bit of pressure, which I'm sure was their intent.
What was the political landscape in the US generally at that time? Like, what were you walking into?
9/11 happened in September. I knew that as soon as I completed the course, I was going to deploy with a squadron to war. Then it was Afghanistan. And then furthermore, when I was going through the course, we knew that elements of the unit had deployed to Afghanistan and were already conducting operations in response to the events of 9/11. So there was a skeleton crew of folks that were left behind that sort of got us in process into the organization formally and into our assigned squadron, issued us some equipment, did a few other administrative things, and then probably less than 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Masira, Oman, and then subsequently from Masira, Oman to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, and I met my team for the first time in combat.
How are you feeling?
Nervous but excited. Those guys, I think, when you show up to a team in combat like that, they were professionals to the highest level. I think they understood that, within 24 hours, we could be conducting a combat operation against enemy combatants, and they needed to know that I was up to speed and capable of performing because I was going to be on their left or their right. I had some funny moments in that very first encounter. Typical young guy on the team, you just want to move fast and keep up with everybody. I think the very first room that I entered in Afghanistan, on the very first compound I was ever in Afghanistan, they have these little short doors, tiny little doors. And I went to go in the room and I had night vision on, and I hit the top of the door with my night vision and busted my nose and popped my night vision off my helmet, and quickly tried to put them back on and recover them before anybody saw it. But I think the thing that stuck with me most, even though there was no shots fired or anything like that, we secured some detainees from the target, but it was how cool, calm, and collected everybody was on the radio. Whereas, in the Army prior, my experiences prior, even in training, people would get worked up on the radio and in communication. And here, the leadership at this place I was at now were just deadpan calm in this combat scenario. So that was very impressive and very impactful for me.
Are you able to talk about the events leading up to the invasion of Iraq?
Yeah. So I did that first deployment to Afghanistan. My squadron redeployed probably in July. I want to say it was close to the end of that summer that the talk of Iraq was kind of really spinning up. I say this at the highest level of the U.S. military, at least from our understanding, is we truly believe that Saddam had some weapons of mass destruction, as they called them then. We believe them to be chemical weapons. He had demonstrated that he had used them on his own people in the past, and we believe that he still had them and was willing to use them. And so I think we started training and preparing for the invasion of Iraq in September, October timeframe.
And your intention of going into Iraq was to locate Saddam and locate these chemical weapons and the other leadership within his government?
Yeah, it's kind of twofold. We had a primary mission of locating WMD initially. I think intelligence at the time believed that it would be outside of the cities. It would be somewhere out in the Western Desert. So we sort of had a plan where we were going to kind of leapfrog from one objective to the other across the Western Desert. And then, the secondary mission was obviously to target Saddam, remove him from power, and kind of all the people that supported him or that were in his chain of command, which I think they dubbed as the deck of cards. So the deck of cards was the top 52 people kind of in the Iraqi leadership chain militarily, and they were all classified as targets. In our case, we really, it kind of became a joke. We were chasing so many things. Saddam was everywhere. He would pop up here, he would pop up there. We would go here, we would go there. And, it got rather exhausting and kind of comical because in the early days of Iraq, particularly with Iraqi leadership, those guys didn't want to get in the fight. Like they knew like the gig was up when we showed up in the middle of the night. And a lot of them didn't put up a fight in the early days. But eventually, about 2 months later, so Iraq, or October, November, early December of '03, we got some intelligence together, and they said, "Hey, we have this guy, Mohammed Ibrahim al-Muslit, that we in the intelligence collection folks always believed that he was the key. He was the key courier for Saddam. He was the person that would know where he was, would know who's around him, and was the person that delivered sort of Saddam's orders to the resistance movement." And the location that intelligence said that he was in was honestly right outside the green zone in Baghdad. And so we didn't believe it. But we loaded up and went out to hit the target like we always did. It was it's kind of an upstairs, 2 apartments with a stairwell that ran up the middle. So we did split team, one team on one door, and my team was on the other. And I was placing a charge on the door, ready to make explosive entry. And somebody bumped into something on the stairs behind me and like made a noise, like clanged metal or whatever. And the guy in the apartment that I was placing the charge on the door of actually came to the door. He looked at me, and when you're explosive breach and you're putting a charge up, your rifle's sort of slung to the side. So I didn't have my rifle accessible, and this guy walks up to the door. So the only thing I could think to do was pull my pistol out and put it up in his face through the glass in the door. And I just mouthed to him, "Open the door." And so he did. And I rode the door in on him and held him against the wall. The team made entry behind me. Small apartment, couple of rooms. I think we called target all secure. Didn't think there was anybody else in. And then, started to kind of go through all the stuff in the apartment. And then one of our guys yelled from the back room, "Hey, there's somebody under the bed back here." And so he called for another teammate. The guy went in. They flipped the mattress up, and laying underneath the bed, flat on the ground with a toy with a plastic AK-47 was Muslit. They took Muslit out, and they did some reconnaissance and had him physically point out the locations where Saddam potentially would be. So by the time we got up there, they had already done that reconnaissance, and they had 2 target locations. And then we started planning to do the assault that night on those 2 targets. So in the town was a house that belonged to a guy named Case, who was Saddam's personal chef. And intelligence folks had always believed that Case was one of the people that would be closest with Saddam. Saddam was very paranoid. He had a very specific diet. He ate fish every day. He had a personal chef because he was always worried about being poisoned. So he had this guy with him for years. And so Case's family house was in the town of Samara. And then he had a family farm that his brothers lived at that was outside of the town. And so we ended up doing a split troop. One troop hit the farm, and my troop hit the house in town that evening. And captured Case, the cook. Battlefield interrogation on site led to him rolling over and saying, "Yes, I am in fact Saddam's personal chef, and that he's located on my farm." About the same time that we finished that target, our sister troop finished on the farmhouse, and Saddam wasn't there, and it wasn't Case's family farm. So again, through some battlefield interrogation and then driving him out and getting him to point out where his farm was, we realized that Muslit, in a last-ditch effort to protect Saddam, had pointed out the wrong farm, hoping that Saddam would hear us and he would get away. But our sister troop, when they took the adjacent farm down, no shots fired. They were dead silent. They did it under night vision in the middle of the night, so they didn't hear or see anything. So Saddam had no idea. So all they did was shift over to the next farm, took that farmhouse down. I think Case's brothers were there. And then, sort of exploitation of the target after it was all secure. They identified the rug outside in the courtyard on the ground, moved the rug, and there was a rope to a styrofoam cork, basically, that was above the hole that Saddam was hiding in. pulled the cork out and looked down, and there was a guy with his hands over his head like this, and reached down and pulled him out of the hole, and lo and behold, it was Saddam Hussein.
How did you feel?
When the call came over the radio, pretty excited. Yeah, I mean, anytime you get asked to do a mission like that, one, you know the historical significance. You're removing the dictator of a country, an evil man that's done awful things to thousands of people for a lot of years. Two, it was like our primary mission. We were asked to do it, and it took us a year, but we got our guy. So, you know, they didn't even say 100%. I think the call that came over the radio from the squadron commander was, we have a possible for blacklist number 1, which was Saddam in the deck of cards. And then we were pretty fired up and pretty excited.
And then he was in jail for about a year?
About a year, yeah. I think they hung him almost exactly 12 months later. They tried him, convicted him of all the crimes and genocide that he had committed, and then subsequently hung him, yeah. So post-Saddam rotation, we went home probably, we caught Saddam in December 13th of 2003. I think we redeployed, my squadron redeployed back to the States in early January of 2004. Had about 6-month break. And, you know, the war really shifted in that time period, that 6 months that we were gone. So by the time we redeployed that summer, so summer of 2004 now, and things were a lot different. The insurgency in Iraq, or the shift to a counterterrorism fight, was full on in swing at that point. We were now chasing, you know, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the various terrorist cells throughout the country, and the leadership that was, you know, calling the shots for that organization. It was a very active summer. We did a lot of, as I've said on things before, we did a lot of commando shit that summer. So a lot of helicopter infills, a lot of targets in downtown Baghdad and downtown Fallujah, downtown Ramadi, chasing, you know, terror cell leaders, bomb makers, really people that were wreaking havoc throughout the country. You know, I remember a particular broad daylight helicopter infill hit in downtown Baghdad, where we synced the aircraft and the ground assault force at the same time. And it really did feel a bit like Hollywood, in that we were both supposed to get there at identical times and make entry to a target house on the ground floor, and then from the top down. And I was on the helicopter infill, and in the planning stage leading up to it, the pilots are phenomenal that support that organization, you know, Special Operations Aviation. So we're in the mission planning for this target, and we're looking at satellite imagery of the building that's the target house. And there's you call them a cupola, but basically it's a door onto the roof. And on top of that door is a little platform that's about, 8 foot wide and 8 foot long. And there's a satellite dish on it. And we told the pilot, hey, we'll drop fast ropes and we'll rope onto the roof. And he said, well, why don't I just land you on the cupola? And we said, well, it's like 8 by 8. And he said, yeah, well, the bird's 6 foot wide or whatever it was. He said, I'll just flare it. I'll blow the satellite dish off the top of the roof. I'll touch the skids down, and you guys just hop off and don't move. And then I'll pull the aircraft out and you can just hop down. And we thought, man, there's no way this guy does this. But sure as shit, he flew in broad daylight, flared the helicopter, blew all the debris off of the roof, landed the bird on the rooftop. We hopped off the skids and just hugged the side of the building, and he lifted off, and then we dropped down and ended up making entry through the top of the building. But it's pretty amazing. You look around and go, man, I can't believe I get paid to do this. We came home that summer, and then my team started changing. So I went off to school for some training. That was about 6 months long. And about 3 or 4 months into that, my squadron redeployed again to Afghanistan in 2005. 2005 was a significant year. While I was in the qualification course, the squadron that was there before us, that was when the IED threat really had kicked off, and they were encountering IEDs kind of pretty regularly along the common routes. And we lost almost a whole team to an IED blast. And so during that deployment, the first thing that happened, and I didn't find out about this till after the fact, but a guy that had came onto my team that was a new guy, that actually replaced me as the team breacher because I was gone, named Steve Langmack. Steve was killed on a target. And then just a couple of weeks later, they were hitting another target out west, and didn't get the right target house to start with, so they ended up shifting to a secondary target. And when they hit that secondary target, as they were making entry into the building, machine gun fire down the hallway ended up killing two other guys, Bob Horgan and Mike McNulty. And Mike was probably my best friend in the organization. He was my best friend in the Army. He was a guy that similar background, went through selection, went through operator training course, went with me. We went to the same squadron. Our kids knew each other. Our wives knew each other. We were pretty tight. And so, that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. It was the first time I'd lost somebody that I was really close with like that. And then I ended up going back to work. And then I found out about Steve, who had replaced me and had been killed on a target shortly before that. And then that year, 2005, it was like this cascade of emotions that now I understand more so, and I understand, what survivor's guilt and survivor's remorse is. But I had this huge hole. I had this feeling like if I was there, maybe Steve wouldn't have been killed because I would have been there and it wouldn't have happened to me, or maybe it would have been me. And because I wasn't there, he ended up replacing me. And I think in the back of my mind, I always assumed I was going to die doing the job. For a lot of years, when you're young, you just, I'm going to go doing what I love is kind of how you pacify yourself with it. But that year really hit me like a ton of bricks. At that point in my life, I felt like deployments were good for me. It was also the first time in my career where I was more comfortable deployed than I was at home. And I started seeing impacts in my personal life, in my marriage, and just in my personality in general. I think functioning stateside when you've been to war year after year after year got harder and harder, and being away got easier and easier. People always ask why? And I think honestly, it's because when you're deployed, when you're at war, you live a very simple life. As complex as the scenarios are and as life and death as it is day after day, it's a simple existence. You wake up in the morning, you digest information and intelligence that all relate to a specific thing, and then you're with a group of people that are highly capable and all focused on the same task, and you all go and move towards that task, and you just do that thing day after day after day. So, you eat, sleep, and go do missions. So it's a very, very simple existence. And right, wrong, or indifferent, it gives you the ability to sort of just turn everything else in your life off.
How much longer were you taking part in active service?
Yeah, so that was after went back for the 06 rotation. At the end of 06, I moved into a different job in the building, still deploying, but I ended up deploying 2 more times, and then left the organization. But yeah, so I was deployed to the Horn of Africa. We were doing a lot of with a small unit. It was a cohort, so it was a couple of guys from each of the Tier 1 assets. So it was a couple of Navy SEALs, and myself and another guy from my organization, a couple of Air Force Special Tactics guys, and so on. And we were doing intelligence collection. Not even sure we were going to be able to prosecute any targets because we were in Africa and not in the Middle East. But basically, we were there to combat the foreign fighter training network that were cradle to graven that target. So the intelligence collection, the planning of the mission, the execution of the mission, and then the subsequent exploitation of all the stuff that we got out of that was all done by a very small group of folks. And so for me, it was one of my most rewarding experiences, I guess. But it was also the last gunfight I ever got in. I was also a lot of injuries and things were catching up to me. I went into that rotation with severe neck pain and some nerve involvement. Just wearing a helmet and night vision for all those years, jumping out of planes, doing all the things we did. I had pretty substantial disc compression, C5, C6 in my neck. was on some pain meds and some other things, and ended up having surgery at the tail end of '07 to replace my C5, C6 disc. And that was a watershed moment for me, because it was back when they used to just feed us pain medication to kind of manage what we were dealing with. And we didn't know enough about prescription narcotics at the time. We didn't know, at least I don't think we knew how addictive they were. I certainly didn't. But that lead up to that next surgery, for me led to a pretty substantial prescription painkiller addiction that I dealt with for a couple years following that. I did deploy one more time. I went back to the Horn of Africa a year later. As I said, we were very productive in that '07 year, so there wasn't a whole lot going on in that '08 deployment, mostly intelligence collection on other things, but the Horn was pretty quiet at the time. I was at a pretty rough point in my life in that, I was in the midst of a pill addiction that I'll say now. It took me a lot of years to deal with. I was self-medicating with alcohol when I wasn't working. And I was having some personal conflict with a teammate that I was deployed with. I made a mistake on that deployment. And that mistake ultimately ended up in me being fired from the organization and having to go out to another unit. So that rotation I did in '08 was my last official rotation or combat deployment as a Delta operator. My whole identity at that point was kind of tied to what I did for a living. So to have that taken away and to not be that person anymore, I really didn't know who I was. It's sort of all culminated in 2010. I woke up one morning really at rock bottom. When you self-medicate with alcohol, and particularly when you're on prescription pain pills, you tend to have a lot of blackout phases. And anybody that's ever struggled with any addiction of any form knows all too well that when you're in the midst of a substance addiction like that, you have large periods of blackout where you don't know what you did or how you got there or how this happened or how that happened. There's some shame and some self-loathing that goes with that stuff. And I was having a particularly rough morning after an evening blackout session, and I found myself on the end of the bed with a pistol in my mouth, and was about this close to taking my own life. To this day, I know all the things that led up to me getting there, but I can't even fathom feeling the way that I felt when I look back on it now. Like, I've come so far from that. But the thing that got me over that moment was I had 2 daughters. I had 2 little girls, and for whatever reason, that's what popped into my head in that moment was, this is a selfish act. Like, you're going to hurt them. Even though it might take your pain away, it's going to hurt everybody that loves you, and you can't do this. And that was enough for me to get me to put it down, put it away. And not long after that, I sought professional help. It was easier for me to understand when someone explained to me that you've suffered some physiological damage because of the exposures that you've had and things that you've done throughout your career. And that physiological damage to your brain is manifesting itself in ways that affect your personality and your mood and your mental health, that's leading to all these other issues. And so it was the first time that I was actually able to step back and look at myself and go, okay, I'm not broken. I'm not useless. I'm not any different than who I ever was. I've just been through a lot of shit. And these are some of the effects that I'm having because of that. And now that I know what they are, I can focus on recovery and getting better from that and moving on. That's why I talk about it today. It's why I share this stuff. And it's why I'm candid about it, because I know that it can be done. And too many years have gone by, and I've lost too many friends over the years, both to suicide and frankly, dying in other incidents where they're, chasing it or they're doing things that they shouldn't be. There's a lot of deaths that aren't attributed to suicide, alcohol related or drug related or whatever, that are absolutely should be suicides. When I retired, I took a break. I was with my now wife, who I also met in that stretch, and was an amazing part of my recovery. Not just because she was a supportive and amazing person, but because she was really the first like person that I was forced to open up to that wasn't a medical professional. And it was because she inherited me when she found me as a kind of a broken man. And I knew that if I wanted to keep this woman around, I needed to be honest and share with her the things that I'd been through and the things that I struggled with. And so, she was instrumental in me learning how to process that information, how to share that information, and how to talk about it in a healthy fashion.
In all your years, Chris, what do you think you're the proudest of?
Probably that I'm still here. I think it's a combination of emotions. One is, I was damn lucky to live through all the shit that I lived through. Not everybody was that fortunate. Two is it almost got the better of me, but it didn't. And yeah, like if all those things hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have the career that I have now. I wouldn't have had all the success post-service that I've had. It was all necessary. But yeah, probably that I'm still here.
The first 4 weeks is called aptitude. It's basically a series of walking over the hills with a pack that gets larger and larger, with a distance that gets further and further. You do exactly what you're told, when you're told, how you're told, and you just walk the hills. I had toenails missing, I had skin off the back, I had blisters on my feet, I had a dislodged retina. I had all sorts wrong with my body by the end of that 4 weeks.